There's been some speculation recently that the Lumix brand may be done for good. And I kind of want to talk about that, why that may be the case, why it might not be the case. And if Lumix is going to move forward, I have some advice, some suggestions that they could probably implement to maybe achieve a little bit more success than they've seen. If you know anything about the Lumix cameras, if you know me, you'll know that I love the Lumix cameras. I think they offer some of the best bang for the buck, some really unique, compelling features that other camera companies still haven't matched to this day. Things like shutter angle, things like open gate. More and more companies are catching up, but Lumix, for whatever reason, has always been at kind of the tip of the spear in terms of offering very premium features at very low price points. And I think that's what's sold these cameras to the kind of independent filmmakers out there, the kind of small business videographers, the people who don't have, tens of thousands of dollars to spend. They're just getting started out, or maybe they're doing music videos. Maybe they're doing weddings. Maybe they're doing corporate stuff. They just have offered so much, going back even to even the GH1, but really the GH2 and then the GH4 and really the GH5, which I think was probably the most popular, the best-selling Lumix camera. And now they've entered full frame, and there's even new compelling features. They finally have phase detect, and they've embraced even some cooler, more interesting stuff like the real-time LUT system that they're playing around with. But so far, the full frame offerings from Lumix have been kind of, I don't know, maybe late to the game, right? Lumix has finally got phase detect in their cameras, but this has taken quite a while. And the flagship series, the S1, which came out, almost, I think 6 years ago now. It's been quite a while since the S1, the S1R, the S1H. Very nice premium cameras, but feeling a little old, feeling a little outdated. Those don't have phase detect. The S5 Mark II and now the new S9, the ultra compact mini full frame Lumix camera with the L mount. These cameras, the modern ones, have phase detect, but there's no real high-end flagship model. The S5 Mark II is probably that premium offering from Lumix, and they've been pushing it quite heavily, which is kind of a good sign to me that they're probably not throwing in the towel. I don't think they're over, considering they're still pushing the S9, the S5 Mark II. People will say maybe they're just trying to clear off their shelves, kind of sell the last little bit of inventory they've got, and then they're going to close up shop. And we're not going to see an S1H Mark II. We're not going to see an S1 Mark II or an S1R Mark II. And that very well could be the case. Businesses, corporations make these types of decisions all the time, where they'll just cut something, even if it's popular, even if it has a loyal fan base. If it's not profitable enough, if they feel like there's money to be made elsewhere, they might just gut it, cut it, and be done. And that could happen with the Lumix brand. I sure hope it doesn't, and I'll give some more reasons why I think that's not the case. But let's just stick with what are the signs that are telling us that the Lumix is over, Lumix is done. Well, Micro Four Thirds, I feel like, has kind of run its course. The recent release of the GH7 was met with a lot of praise and people excited to finally see that camera. But it seems like after the announcement, after the launch of the GH7, it's really kind of the hype has died down quite a bit. I have a GH7. I really quite like it. But it is, in a lot of ways, just a GH6 with phase detect. And the GH6 wasn't even all that popular compared to the GH5. And I couldn't tell you the reason. I think most of it is kind of chalked up to the fact that the people who are in the market for that type of camera are really, really happy with the GH5. It does basically everything you could ever want for a smaller independent content creator type of person. Yes, there's ways to move up in your profession and your career, and I feel like people do that, and they end up going either the Sony route with kind of the FX line, the FX3, the FX6, something like that, or they'll go the Blackmagic route and they'll get something like the new Pixis or something where it's like a little bit more of like the cinema style. I've talked a lot about why those aren't personally my favorite cameras. I've shot on the Ursa Mini G2. I really like the cameras from Blackmagic. I think in terms of just pure picture quality, they offer really, really high value products. But the form factor is not my favorite. But that's a whole nother video, all things considered. So I'd say the fan base around the GH5, for the most part, is really happy with that camera. And the GH6 didn't offer enough compelling upgrades. And even the GH7 is kind of like, well, I mean, I'm still working with the GH5. That's great. And if they're really going to get something else, they're going to go probably full frame, maybe a more cinema style box camera or something like that. Whereas the Lumix diehards, the fan base, the S1, the S1H, the S1R, those are so old now. I think everyone was looking for that upgrade, which in a lot of ways was the S5 Mark II. And I also have an S5 Mark II. I think it's a great camera. It's probably the best full frame camera I could consider right now in terms of price to value, like that price point of what you can get an S5 Mark II, especially even used. You can get great deals on this camera, and it does even more than you could ever want. It's really, truly incredible if you're looking for something that checks the box of it's full frame, which was a big kind of disadvantage that Lumix had for so long, that it was just micro four thirds, no full frame offerings for so long, really, I think started to eat away at the customer base, because people want, for whether you believe it's true or not, people think they need or they want full frame. And when you're looking at the Lumix cameras and you're saying, well, these are only micro four thirds, that's even smaller than APS-C in terms of sensor size, I got to go look somewhere else. I got to go Sony, I got to go Nikon, I got to go Canon, something like that. Well, now that Lumix has full frame cameras with the S series, they're playing catch up in so many ways. And that was the big knock against Lumix for so long, was the sensor size is too small. And then they have full frame sensors, and then the criticism is, well, it doesn't have good autofocus for video, which now finally we're there. We've played catch up, and we've got phase detect in not only the full frame cameras, but also the micro four thirds. But I think micro four thirds is kind of, it's certainly reached its end of life, and you can see that Lumix is trying to pivot to the full frame offerings, putting that at the forefront, more focus on the full frame sensor, because in today's market, that's what a lot of people think they want or think they need, and it helps differentiate these cameras from an iPhone, from a smartphone that's in your pocket. Which are already doing the shallow depth of field look by having these kind of cool depth of field effects that you can add to the photo, capturing that depth information on a smartphone to make it look like it was taken with a full frame camera. So when you look at micro four thirds, I think there's still a lot of advantages. For me personally, it's not even about the sensor size, really. It kind of is, in terms of the lens size, which means just more compact, a little bit lighter weight, all valuable features. And I wish, and I know a lot of people wish, that Lumix pushed micro four thirds more in that direction, more compact, more lightweight. If we've got these smaller lenses, let's have smaller camera bodies. But that just doesn't seem to be the trend that Lumix has embraced with the G9 Mark II and the GH7. So we'll see. I could imagine there's a few more micro four third cameras on the horizon. Maybe they'll do one last hurrah with something super compact, like the GX9 was like a great, awesome camera. There could be a GX9 Mark II, I think, could sell pretty well. But you're shrinking fan base because people are going towards full frame. And until they change their marketing around Lumix, I think they're going to continue to struggle. Sony has eaten up such a big portion of the market, because Sony, when you look at it, it's a full, robust ecosystem. You can get into photography and shoot Sony. You can get into video and shoot Sony. You can get into film and shoot Sony. And basically, for the most part, all those cameras, all those lenses play nice together. They feel very familiar, although I do have some criticisms for the Sony camera menus, and just their more cinema line stuff feels still way too broadcast, from where the menus just feel like really dated TV menus where you're just scrolling for pages and pages, especially on something like the FX6. But that's kind of beside the point. The real value of Sony is the ecosystem. And the same is true sort of with Canon. They've kind of I don't know where they're ultimately going to end up, where they kind of want to do the cinema thing, but then they don't have that many offerings, and the RF mount is great, some awesome glass for Canon RF, but it still doesn't feel like as complete as what Sony is offering. But at the end of the day, that doesn't really matter, and doesn't seem to historically not mattered for Canon all that much. They have their photographer fan base that shoots Canon, and you have your diehard Canon loyalists, and they just kind of stick with it because they like the way those cameras look and feel. And Nikon is kind of there on the fringes, testing the waters, trying new things, buying red. We'll see where that goes. But ultimately, Lumix has always been kind of the dark horse, the underdog, the sleeper, where if you're in the know and you really want to get the most out of your cameras, I feel like the people who are paying attention are probably choosing Lumix, but it's really hard when your general consumer, your average person is out there and they just see people shooting with Sony, shooting with Canon, and it's a familiar brand. You recognize that there's all that legacy, longevity in those brand names. It just seems familiar and it seems easy and seems popular. And a lot of times those are the things that kind of rise to the top. The popularity builds momentum that is kind of inevitable. It's inescapable. Just because you see it all the time, oh, it must be good. Everyone else is shooting with this thing. I probably should too if I want to kind of fit in and work alongside other people. If they're all shooting Sony, you'll probably go Sony. If you know a bunch of people who are shooting Canon, you'll probably go Canon. I've never had a problem being the outsider, being the weird person that's got the camera that no one's ever heard of. And even to this day, Lumix is still that way. If someone asks, which happens frequently, hey, what type of camera is that? And I'll say Lumix. Still to this day, after like 20 years of the brand existing, your regular person on the street still has no idea what a Lumix is. But if you say Sony, you say Red, you say Canon, Nikon, they've heard those names. And I think that's what needs to change with Lumix. For the longest time, Lumix was always tied to Panasonic. And for whatever reason, I've made plenty of videos about this over the years of like, why aren't the cameras called Panasonic? They're this own separate brand, but Lumix doesn't even have its own website. If you go to lumix.com, I think it's a light bulb company, or it has nothing to do with the cameras. It's not owned by Panasonic. And it just seems like the branding has always been a little confusing. People said it was the Panasonic GH5. And only recently, and maybe I play a small part in this, like people starting to say the name Lumix more and building that brand reputation. But that's tough when your only offerings are known historically as Micro Four Thirds, and you technically have full frame cameras now, but you have no future kind of roadmap. There's no progression. If you buy a bunch of L mount lenses, you can't really imagine like what are the premium professional cinema cameras that you're going to use that on. Now we're slowly entering that territory with Blackmagic, and we'll see if DJI offers anything in terms of like a new camera from them. I know that's been heavily rumored and speculated for a while that DJI is going to offer something beyond, the Ronin 4D, which is kind of a unique, weird niche style camera, something a little bit more mainstream. If DJI gets in the market, has the L mount, which I believe they are part of the L mount alliance. So there's a lot of camera companies, Leica, Panasonic, Sigma, I said Panasonic, Lumix, Blackmagic, DJI. I think they're all part of the L mount alliance. So they can use this mount and they can embrace L mount glass. But there really aren't, the ecosystem doesn't feel big enough. It doesn't feel like if I buy these lenses that I'm going to be able to use them in a variety of different ways, regardless of the project size. Where Sony E-mount, arguably you can easily justify those lenses because they work basically across the board, whether you're doing photo, video, or cinema. And same thing is true with Canon and the RF. You can see it head in that direction. It was a little more clear when Red was so closely associated, even though there was no formal relationship between Red and Canon. They always played nice. Red had the EF mount and then the RF mount. Now that's kind of up in the air a little bit with the Nikon acquisition. But with Lumix, it's hard to see that roadmap of if I invest in this system, where's it headed? What am I getting out of it? And how does it all play nicely together? I think to be truly successful, Panasonic, Lumix, has to go all in on whatever branding it's going to be. If you associate Panasonic with microwaves and random other like appliance type products, and it doesn't TVs, and it doesn't apply to cameras, like, okay, fine. Then like, let's go all in on Lumix. Let's get it its own website. Let's make it its own presence that we get out there. And this is a brand that people can know and trust and keep touting the features that I see them getting out there. Like OpenGate is a huge one. 180-degree shutter angle, another huge one. Shutter angle in general, just having the ability to set that on the camera. But they're kind of like complicated concepts to convince the layperson that these are things you would want or need to know and why they make your life easier. Even to this day, people don't understand shutter angle or they don't really get the benefits of OpenGate. They think, I'll just film vertical if I need to, and anamorphic is certainly not nearly as popular or as attractive as it once was. It still has its fan base, and there's still people out there who love anamorphic, but I want to say maybe 10 years ago, it was a lot more exciting to think of shooting like 2x anamorphic stuff than nowadays, where people want the electronic features like the autofocus more than they care about anamorphic. Everything's gone vertical in social media, so why would I want to shoot ultra wide when I really need to be framing for, tall images? So I think it's doubling down, tripling down on the Lumix brand to actually get the most out of it. Let this make it a household name, get it out there, make features. And I think they're trying this with the S9, but it's still not quite hitting the mark. The S9 is a nice compact, but we don't really have small compact lenses that still have, a wide aperture where you can get some of those full frame benefits of the shallow depth of field in a compact, pancake style lens. I know there's a lot of optics and physics involved in that. It's not always perfectly possible, but some interesting options that really showcase the benefits of full frame while still being as compact to pair with something like an S9. And then from the S5 Mark II, let's look forward to like an S1H Mark II. The biggest feature I've harped on for the last 10 years, it feels like, is internal electronic NDs. Having an internal ND is a game changer if you are a filmmaker, cinematographer, videographer, whatever you call yourself. I'm sure you would value having ND filters, a click of a button away or like a little spin of a wheel away. That fourth component of your exposure diamond, which is what I like to call it, not the exposure triangle, it's the exposure diamond, ND filters. Having that built right into the camera, it was laughed at, I want to say, 15 years ago. Cinema cameras didn't have ND filters built in. It was a broadcast thing. If you're a cinematographer, you have a matte box and you're putting ND filters in front of the camera. But nowadays, you have plenty of high-end, cinema style cameras that have ND filters built in because it's so convenient. And so much of the content that we're capturing these days, it runs a spectrum. Yeah, you might be on a movie set one day, but maybe you're filming a documentary the next day, or maybe you are on location doing a news report a month later, and maybe you're doing a short film or a music video. You're bouncing around. The kind of right tool for the job is appropriate. It is true. But also there's a lot of owner operators who want to buy the tool that can do almost everything, kind of the Swiss Army knife of production, especially when you're spending 10, 20, 30 grand on a camera in some cases. You want to be able to do a lot with it. And I think Blackmagic has really tapped into that, and you see the value there where they're offering really premium features at attractive price points. Very smart, but they're still missing certain things like compelling autofocus and in-body image stabilization, which I feel like for content creators is far more important. You maybe have that kind of production professional who wants the Blackmagic cameras, and there's certainly a great way to justify it. The dynamic range, the resolution, the frame rate options on Blackmagic are incredible, and even the new box style is a really nice form factor. But I'd wager there's a lot of people in that kind of hybrid shooter market, the Sony people, who like the fact that they can take a photo and they can switch to video and they can make a reel, or they can shoot a music video, or they can go film a commercial, depending on what the project calls for. And having a camera and lens system that can do all of that is exactly why I prefer Lumix. The S5 Mark II is basically the camera that I would want for almost anything, but it's about the only camera that I can think of that's like that. And I really wish Lumix would get out a few more, get an S1H Mark II out that has internal ND filters. Huge, amazing feature. Get it around $3,000. If you say an S5 Mark II is like $1,500 right now, I think used, maybe it's a little more expensive new. But if you can get around, if you're over $4,000 on an S1H Mark II, I think it's kind of missed the mark. But if it's anywhere between $3,000 and $4,000 for an S1H Mark II, that to me is the perfect price point, granted that it has an internal electronic ND. And I would imagine, great stabilization, great autofocus, beautiful dynamic range, lots of resolution options. If there's 8K in there, I think that'd be very welcome, considering now it's seemingly becoming the standard for camera acquisition. 8K is the new 4K, I think, in a lot of ways. 6K is like a nice in between, but I don't think anyone really thinks of it like as that impressive. They go, okay, 6K, all right, yeah. But if you say 8K, okay, now we're talking. And if you're shooting 8K 60, which I believe some of the newer Nikons will do, I mean, that's a wonderful, amazing, high-end premium camera that can be your top-tier A cam to your S5 Mark II as like your B cam or something like that. And then even go lower, have even cheaper options than the S9. Like that's your ultra compact, but like have some more options in that market as well. And I think really build out all the camera. I mean, for a while, Panasonic was doing, the VariCam, the cinema style cameras, and they closed up shop and said it was becoming part of Lumix, but then like nothing really ever came of that. So I don't know if we're ever going to see a VariCam or anything high-end cinema from Panasonic, but that'd be one other nice offering. You don't need a lot of options, but you need different options at these different price points and for these different types of consumers, because the consumers aren't static. And I feel like that's what a lot of people miss, is that just because someone is an amateur now doesn't mean they're going to be an amateur forever. And a lot of people make decisions based off of like their investments for the future. What am I going to buy now that's going to pay returns 5 or 10 years down the line when I am now a professional, or now I'm actually on film sets and I'm shooting high-end blockbuster movies, or maybe I'm out doing documentaries and I'm starting in my bedroom as a YouTuber, but I want to get into documentary filmmaking. What are the things I'm buying now that are going to stick with me for that long term? If you're spending $1,000, $2,000 on a lens, you want to know that it has some longevity, that you're not going to have to just sell it and take a loss in the short-term future. It's something that can grow with you regardless of where you're at in your career. That fact seems to be lost on a lot of these when we talk about demographics, marketing, who's the customer for these products. Those customers change, and there's even professionals, right, who are cinematographers, who are high-end filmmakers, but they want a camera that they can take with them on vacation to like just take pictures of their family. Having an ecosystem that covers all those bases is useful for that customer, even though it's hard to quantify them in a demographic. So when you build the whole ecosystem for all of those demographics, and what applies to one sort of applies to another, just in a slightly different way, like who's going to say they don't want autofocus? There's a lot of people who will say, I don't need autofocus. But if it's an option, you can turn on and off on the camera. It doesn't hurt to have it. Same thing with an internal ND. You never have to use it. You never have to touch it. But having it there as an option is really nice. Same thing with the in-body image stabilization. That was sort of like a niche, cool, interesting feature. I want to say, there's always been image stabilization in the lens and in body, but it's like the GH5 is really when that clicked for me, as like, this is something really, really valuable that I can actually use quite a bit. I don't need it all the time, but I would say for the 99% of the time, I'm using it for the way I shoot. But you don't have to. You can turn it off. Having those features that can apply to different scenarios at a high level, a low level, that can adapt and go with the consumer wherever they're at in their career and their journey, up, down, or sideways, I think makes the whole ecosystem a lot stronger, more recognizable, because you can say, oh, I've seen that brand. They shot this movie with that camera, and I can go buy it at Walmart or Best Buy. A similar thing, right? That was never true for Red. I mean, for as much as Red tried to cater down with like the Raven, the Ranger, the Komodo, it still always felt like a premium high tier. I think the cheapest Red ever maybe was like $4,500. Like that's not cheap. That's not the $1,000 or less than $1,000 camera that Sony has an abundance of. Canon, I really can't say. They have lots of options at all different price points, but Canon, it always feels like you're missing the feature you actually need, regardless of where you're at, until you just buy the more expensive one. And then you say, okay, well, why do these cheaper ones even exist? But Sony did a really good job of that, offering a lot of products at a lot of different price points. And I think Lumix can get there, even just offering like a handful of products. Have your low end consumer, your prosumer, your professional, your cinema line, and call them all the same thing. Stick with the Lumix branding if that's really what you want to focus on. Don't have VariCam, Panasonic, Lumix, and then people wonder, like, are these the same thing? Oh, well, they don't even share the same mount. I need different lenses for each of them. It's really kind of confusing, and it feels like you're really stuck with what you're buying, and you don't have that flexibility to grow into what you have and level up and upgrade down the line, or just take it with you on vacation. If you're buying a VariCam, you're not going to shoot home movies with a VariCam, and vice versa. If you're buying a Lumix GH2 back in the day, yeah, people were shooting, short films and stuff on them, but you weren't thinking this is a Hollywood blockbuster camera. Although, what was it? Upstream Color was shot on a GH2, I believe. So there were some indie films that were shot on the GH2, but it didn't have the same universal appeal that Canon really got out there with their DSLRs and their Cinema EOS line. That whole mentality of having the high end and the low end and it all works well together, I think is really smart. And it's been the one thing that's missing for Lumix. So if they are going to stick with it, which I hope they do, because I think from a consumer value standpoint, there is no greater value than the Lumix cameras. I just need something that gives people a faith that there's a roadmap, a future, a full line of offerings that all play nicely together, that I can buy the lenses for one system, they'll work for the other. And I think it would go a long way in convincing people to invest. The S5 Mark II is already that. There's plenty of people who have gotten into L-mount because of the S5 Mark II, because it's such a powerful camera. But at the same time, you have people go looking at it like the S5 Mark II is it. And that's the only thing. I'm buying all these lenses for one camera. Where's it go next? And I think seeing a bigger picture roadmap, more offerings across all price points would really help the system as a whole and actually give Lumix an advantage, because there are great cameras, but you're kind of taking a risk at the current point in time going, am I going to invest in this? I don't know how much future it has. Getting that reassurance, seeing the high end, the low end would really help convince more people, I think, to leave Sony because it's got its own set of problems. Leave Canon, it's got its own set of problems. Nikon, same thing. And really go all in on the Lumix cameras as well as the L-mount and feel like they're going to get the most out of it no matter what type of content it is they're capturing.